Welcome everybody. How y'all doing? This is Mario Matthews, owner and operator of Minutes Till Dawn Productions. Minutes Till Dawn Productions is an entertainment media production company focused on empowering Black families. Today, I have the honor of having an amazing guest here on the platform. It is Professor Carl Livingston, and he is an amazing professor at Seattle Central College. And I can't do him honor justice enough. I'll let him do a lot of the, talking on his own behalf. But welcome to the platform, Mr. Carl, Mr. Livingston. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Mario. I'm so glad to be here with your viewers, with your program. You're a very good student of mine, and I'm proud of the work you're doing in the community. This is important.
Thank you. You're a big inspiration when it comes to politics, man. I really appreciate it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into sort of introduction of yourself, because you had a very long history when it comes to engaging into politics and engaging into the community, the Black community here in Seattle. Go ahead and tell us about yourself, your expertise, and your time working in the community.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to do that. I'm known sometimes in the Puget Sound area as pastor, professor, and attorney Carl Livingston, because those are three of the four big things I'm doing. I am a professor. Let me start with that. As you have already said, at Seattle Central College. Seattle Central College, it's really like a historically Black, historically minority school, because it was African Americans and others from the community that made the city of Seattle and the state of Washington have a full-scale school, full-scale community college at this site. They were only going to build an industrial or a vocational school here, and the community said no, 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 and no group more than the Black Panthers stood up to make sure that they built a full-scale school here. Professor Pete Knutson does a good job as well up here at Seattle Central, saying the very same thing. A white male who's very woke and very active. I am also a pastor. I'm senior pastor at Kingdom Christian Center, where we have been serving for 11 years. I first started as pastor at Grace United Methodist Church, where I served almost 4 years. And then I'm also an attorney. I started practicing about 33 years ago. And so I practiced law. I got a specialty in construction and design litigation. And then lastly, I am a writer. I'm the author of a affirmative action article that was published around technically 1996, but it wasn't really released by the Howard Law Journal until 1998. It's called Affirmative Action on Trial, the retraction of affirmative action in the case for its retention. And then I'm the author of Shoestrings and Bootstraps, a development plan for Black America. I was asked to write that book by the Black Dollar Days Task Force and Pastor Robert Jeffrey. And then finally, I am working right now on a work that I believe explains what's been happening to people of darker color, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, for the last 50 years. And it's about the Southern Strategy. It's called Southern Strategy, a book on the story of the Southern Strategy and how it has affected an American family. So I'm going to talk about my family in light of the Southern Strategy and that history, to make it real and make it pop, so that people can see how to stop this Southern Strategy from working and what to do to make sure that we get basically paid for what's been happening to us, not in money, but in programs and things that help us build wealth.
Man, that's powerful. Thank you. Thank you for so much for sharing all of that powerful information. So let's go ahead and move on to some of the interview questions that we have for today. And let's see, I give you question number one. So question number one will be, let me me go ahead and bring that up for you if you don't mind. Sorry about that. Here we go. All right. So question number 2, actually. So tell the audience about I-200 and about your decades-long opposition towards the initiative here in Washington State.
All right. Well, I-200 was an initiative that a group of mainly whites, there were a few blacks in there pushing it, but it was mainly pushed by a guy named Tim Eyman, who said he was inspired by a half African-American man named Ward Connerly from California. And I-200 passed in November of 1998. It passed to stop affirmative action, but not for everybody. It passed to stop, or it was proposed and then passed, to stop affirmative action for race and sex. So it ended affirmative action for African Americans, women, Native Americans, and all the other ethnic groups, but it preserved affirmative action for veterans and those with disabilities. And that's mainly whites in Washington. So African Americans mainly and other ethnic groups fought to get affirmative action. And what they did is kept it in place for themselves and took it away from us. I did everything I could to fight it. I had already published I had published Affirmative Action on Trial, that Howard Law Journal article, so I could use that, and basically I was the most educationally and academically supported opponent of affirmative action in this area. And so I debated with Tim Eyman at Seattle Central College and trying to stop what he was doing. I debated Tim Eyman. I mean, it was on the marquee, it was on the board out there on Broadway. I debated Tim Eyman at Seattle University. And then there were Washington State representatives and senators that were trying to stop affirmative action. One of them, his last name, I think, was Johnson. And he was served some community down south, like Puyallup. I'm not sure exactly which one, but I debated him at Pacific Lutheran University. I spoke as much as I could. I made as many marches as I could. And yet we could not stop the initiative from being passed. Not enough people stood up. And to tell you the truth, there were whites that we thought would work with us, especially white women. We figured we would get 90% of white women because they were getting more affirmative action than people of color, and that's how it should be, because they're 51% of the population. They should be getting 51% for all that happened to hold women back. And yet, even though affirmative action was economically benefiting white women, somewhere around 40% to half of them voted with white males. And at that time, whites were over 80% of the population. And so it was mainly going to be whites that settled the question. And to lose that healthy percentage of white women, we didn't have enough support to protect what we were owed, which was, after all of that, after basically more than 200 years of slavery and about 100 years of segregation, the country owed us at least 100 years of a remedy to fix what they had done. And that's what affirmative action was only doing a little bit. Only a little bit wasn't helping. And that little bit they didn't want to do. It was wrong. It was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm very happy you actually mentioned that dynamic within your response when it comes to, corresponding with white women voters and, tying back the original intent to address the historic slavery of Black people that are the descendants of slaves. It addressed the historic effects that was essentially taking place, barring us from public and private sector institutions in order to have our stake in the economy. So that same parallel actually happened during the last national election with Trump and Hillary. You found that a very large percentage, over like 55% of white women, actually voted for Donald Trump, regardless of his actual record and the things that he stated on camera when it came to sexual assault or anything like, things like that. You're telling me that these same voting patterns has happened already in the 90s, correct?
Well, that's true, and that's the part of the beauty and the power of the womanist movement, particularly African American women like Bell Hooks and others, but also Native American and Latino women that have felt the need to speak very directly to white women and say, hey, listen, we couldn't always count on you all to back us, whether we're talking about slavery, segregation, what just happened with I-200, and now Donald Trump. And the good thing about that is there are some women that will listen and some white women that will listen, and they will think about their privilege and how there's been this history to really not side with justice and fairness. And yeah, it is true that a healthy percentage, and again, probably around 40% or more of white women voted for Donald Trump. And that helped Donald Trump win. Now we have to take some responsibility because there were a number of people of color that decided not to show up in that 2016 election. And we just didn't come to the polls like we did with Obama. And that could have made the difference. The Russians were cheating, and the Trump campaign was working with them. So would it have made the difference? I'm not sure, but we always have to take responsibility for whatever we do. And so to a little degree, we handed it to them. But yes, a number of times in the battle, we have had issues with white women not really supporting us. Now, there are white women that would say, back in Kansas, around 1850s, I think it was Frederick Douglass and some of the others sided more with the white males at the time because they were deciding, are we going to give African Americans the right to vote? Are we going to give it to women? We can't do both. And, Frederick Douglass made the argument that, hey, listen, we're dying. We're dying. It's not that I was leaving you in order to do that, but I felt if it was either going to be one or the other, we are dying. So I had to go that way. Well, that really hurt Susan B. Anthony and many of the others, and they felt like they had their issue. And thankfully, she spoke face to face with Frederick Douglass over that. Let him know she was upset about that. And there were these cleavages that go back 100 years or more that we have to work out. So when I bring it up about white women, I'm not bringing it up like as if we're always right. And I'm not bringing it up as if we want to trash them all the time. We have to, and you're not either. We're bringing it up because we're trying to speak truth and we're trying to get something done. And we have to talk about the facts as they really are. And we got to move forward because sometimes this white privilege lifts up white males at the expense of everybody, even white women. And to that degree, we should be able to count on white women more consistently to help us, and they ought to count on us in the Me Too movement and some of the others to help them. We got Black women at stake, and we ought to be supporting them, and their interests sometimes are being supported by white women. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they are.
So I'm very happy that you mentioned interest, because that's what our next question is going to get into, okay? So let's go ahead and move on to the next question. So now question number 3, I-1000 reinstates affirmative action in Washington State that was passed this year, and it went uncontested. However, it also adds the following categories to groups who are eligible to be included in affirmative action. It adds honorably discharged veterans, sexual orientation, age, and or sensory, mental, or physical disabilities. Now, since both public and private institutional job markets are highly competitive, drowning in anti-Black racism from many different non-Black groups, and in some cases, groups that are identified as Black, whether of immigrant or native, native origins here in America, is it advantageous for Black American descendants of slavery to, in Washington state, to continue to politically advocate for any group whose action shows to be our opponents rather than our allies?
Well, I think I'm following you in that. I think your concern is that a number of those with disabilities, those that have the military connection in the state of Washington are white. And sometimes we haven't been able to count on them all the time to support what it is we're trying to do. And yet when we do what we do in the past, we've often helped so many other groups. And at the end of the day, when the money comes, we get left out again. So we fight for things, we help all kind of groups, and they don't fight for us. I am glad that they put those groups in, and it may sound strange for me to say that, because it was so hard to pass this through. It was so difficult, and you got to be strategic. Sometimes you can't fight every fight at the same time. You have to fight one battle, rest a little bit, and you got to go to the next one. You know, you got to use the Bruce Lee techniques. You know, a lot of times he dealt with one, and then he dealt with the other. And you know, when you're in a big battle, you got to be strategic. And to bring in that military component was a good idea because they were already in anyway. And so it gave us something to say that didn't really hurt what we're trying to do. Because remember, I said I-200 preserved affirmative action for veterans. And so you bring that in. Now here's what they did with I-200. They said I-200 is going to push civil rights. That was the first statement, because they knew that that didn't do anything. It was mainly taking away affirmative action. So to say that was just strategic. So we used that same strategy against them. So affirmative action was already there for veterans. To mention it gave us something to say when we're pushing it through. So that was a wise thing. And I really want to support Jesse Weinberg, so many groups, so many African-American and other minority groups for being strategic with this, because we couldn't even get a vote. We couldn't even get this thing, the affirmative action brought up in the Washington state legislature into a committee to vote on it. And then when we finally got a committee to vote on it, we couldn't get it on the floor. So I was very impressed when they pushed this through. What about those with disabilities? Well, those with disabilities, they were also under I-200. So to mention them again, and they mentioned them more specifically though, again, I felt it was very strategic. And in a state that is now, I think Washington is about 80% white, there's just some things you have to do to get it through, because it's going to be a big, big battle. This is similar to what Barack Obama said. See, sometimes perfect can be the enemy of good, or sometimes best can be the enemy of better. So what am I trying to say? We want it to be perfect. We want it to be the best thing. And so, but you can't get that for the most part in the world. So what you have to try to do is get through the things that make it better, the things that are good. And then when you get on that ground, you take a break, and then you go right back and move some more to get the rest of what you want. And anybody that's been in a relationship knows exactly what I mean, because you get into a relationship, you got this fine lady, this lady got this fine guy. You can't get everything you want. You got to work it out. You got to compromise. Life is like that. Anybody raise children, they get older and older and older. You realize I can't always get them to do everything I want to do. We got to work this out. And life is like that. It's about compromise. So I thought it was strategic. And it means, though, that even after we pass laws like this, we can't stop. Now we got to go push contracts. We got to go get the money. And even after that, we got to make sure that it gets all the way down to the hood. Because what they'll do a lot of times is help Native Americans, Asian Americans, and we don't see anything in the hood. So we can't stop. We have to keep working all the way down so that the dollar gets all the way into Jamal's bank account. We got to work all the way into the dollar gets all the way down to Shaniqua's purse. And that's the battle that we always are in. We can never stop.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm actually glad you mentioned the part about the money being actually the bottom line in order to help us get to us where we need to be. I think the discrepancy lies is the tactics or the way that that's going to happen with a lot of us in the community, trying to figure out the best way of getting to that place to where we are actually fairly represented within the economy of the United States, which I wanted to bring up this particular notion. So you mentioned, compromise in order to, bring us to the forefront with other groups in order to put our issues on the table so it could be addressed in that manner. However, at what cost? That's going to be my question. Now, the reason why I say this question is because this aligns with my next question, and I actually got some some stuff I want to mention to you that I'm not sure whether or not you've heard before. So I'll just state question number 4, and then I will state a little bit about why I posed the question the way that I posed it. So question number 4 is I-200 banned affirmative action for 20 years, and according to you, it actually preserved it for, honorably just discharged veterans and people with disabilities. Now, that's 20 years of barred opportunity for Black people who are the descendants of American chattel slavery, many of who ended up as victims of mass incarceration, gentrification, homelessness, and a whole host of other things that we are overrepresented, disproportionately affected by. So in your assessment, could you give affirmative action, could affirmative action have had a proactive impact to largely prevent this occurring? Now, mind you, right now, the massive amount of gentrification going on in Seattle and other places in Washington State has essentially dwindled our population to very, very low numbers. We've got people either moving south of Tacoma or moving out of the state altogether. Now, in that 20-year time period, right, people, Black people who are the descendants of American slavery, if they had affirmative action in place at the time, many of these people probably could have found jobs and gainful employment that would have prevented them from being victims to the same things that we're talking about right now. So with that being said, do you think affirmative action, if it was in place at that time, could have prevented a large percentage of this from happening to our community?
Yes, I do. And it wasn't going to be a cure-all, but it would have prevented a lot of the gentrification and a lot of the issues that we have faced. Mm-hmm. The conservatives and the racists have been fighting anything that brings real money and resources to the Black community all the way back to when those 1960s and 70s programs began. So affirmative action itself pretty much started when the Philadelphia Plan was launched around about 1970, I want to say 71. I know it was launched by about 73. And when that plan was, when it was put in place, it was put in place by a Republican Black and I'm trying to remember his name. He was the Assistant Secretary of Labor, and I had a conversation with him. That program in Philadelphia brought so much money into the Black community. Immediately, whites all across the nation knew, if we're going to keep holding African Americans back, we've got to stop this money coming into their businesses, into their communities. So the first big attack on it was in the Bakke case and all of that move around there to call it quotas.
Yep.
And that took a big piece of money out of it, because before you could just set aside a big old piece of the contract and just say, we're going to give 10% to Blacks, 5% to this group, and all of that, because of the past discrimination. All right. So
now to clarify, that's on a national scale too. That's not just statewide, that's nationally, right?
Right. But it was happening in the state of Washington as well. And so, and actually the state of Washington had the DeFunis case, DEFUNIS, 2 years before Bakke. That would have been the main Bakke case, but the Supreme Court decided they wouldn't hear it. It was on, at the University of Washington, seats set aside directly for Blacks to go into under affirmative action. They said, oh, he's already in the school. We're going to hold his moot and not decide it at this time. 2 years later came Bakke. And so Bakke became the case. Washington had the same contracting going to Blacks and educational seats set aside and things like that going to Blacks in education that later were outlawed as quotas. So that was the first big hit. The next big hit on affirmative action came around the time of I-200. And it happened in another case that the Supreme Court had from all these AGC people and all that suing. And what the Supreme Court said is, if you don't have a study that shows there is existing discrimination against certain groups, you can't have affirmative action. So again, they're taking away from it more and more and more. Well, that had happened even before I-200. And they wanted to hurt us so bad in the state of Washington that they kept going with this initiative, even though that decision had come down around 1998. And I'm going to tell you how bad it hurt our community. It hurt the community so bad that businesses like Table 100 immediately saw their money start to dry up. Because the big area only left to us was the public contracting area where government money is spent. The private contracting area is probably like 2/3 of all contract. It's what built most of downtown. They don't even think about working with us. We got to work on when they're building a city office building, when they're building sound transit or something like that. That's the best hope we got left. And contractors like Table 100, they were fighting I-200 because they knew if we lose this, we lose that 1/3 of the contracting out there. These folks in the world and in Washington, these old boy network white businesses, white contractors, they'd rather lose money, pay 1% more, 5% more, and go with whites or others that they know than help African-American contractors. And
now,
so
hold on one second. Okay, go ahead. Well, okay, so 1 second. You mentioned others that they know, because make no mistake, there are some minority groups who are getting these government contracts and who are benefiting from affirmative action. We've already established that for all intents and purposes, white women are the #1 recipients of affirmative action, despite their voting record. And we're already establishing that there are already other minority businesses, like construction companies that are owned primarily by Latino descended people, or maybe there's I know for some Asian contracting companies that are actually have their own businesses where they work with contractors to service homes and stuff like this. Like, these contracts are going to quote unquote minorities. But for some strange reason, what I'm hearing is a lot of these contracts are not flowing into the pockets of African American or Black American descendants of slavery. So,
right. So what happened?
Like, what is that?
So when I-200 was passed, especially after what had happened already in the Supreme Court cases that came down in the middle 90s, we saw more than half of all contracting dollars going to minorities and women be taken away. So it was less money. So yes, some are benefiting, but everybody, women and all ethnic groups, are suffering because I-200 is gone. The wave, though, that came to take away I-200, and the Supreme Court, and that put these Supreme Court justices in place that passed these restrictive Supreme Court cases, sent a signal to them, hey, you ain't got to help African Americans. So if we do help minorities and women because they're federal dollars going in, if they're federal dollars, if it's all state, they don't have to do anything to help those groups. They just got to help. They help some disadvantaged businesses, but those could be white males. So if it's federal money, though, they still got to do some kind of affirmative action. They just made sure that it went to groups that didn't look like us. Then there were some groups that, like at Sound Transit and other places, said they were African American, and they gave them big contracts. These are like Bellingham African American companies, getting like something like 80% of the dollars. And these contractors who are really from Seattle, really from Tacoma, really from the area, they made sure they didn't get anything. When that money did not come to those businesses, the Davidson construction companies, Venco with Howard Terry, and on and on and on, including architects like Donald King, they began to go out of business.
Is there a way? Oh, I'm sorry. Keep going.
And I'm just trying to make the point. When that money leaves the Black community, you can't pay your mortgage for your nice place. You can't pay your real estate taxes. You have got to go. And something like that happened to Blacks up here. And affirmative action had a lot to do with it. Now, let me make a quick point because I got to give a shout out. I've had my issues with James Kelly and the things that he's done since he left the commission, the Washington State Commission on African American Affairs. But one of the finest periods was when James Kelly was over the Washington State Commission on African American Affairs back in 1997 and 1998. And he did 3 reports that almost stopped I-200. He helped lead that. He went to University of Washington. He talked to the Black professors up there, like Thad Spratlin, and I can't remember the gentleman's name that used to be the dean of the business school, and they did thorough reports. They fought hard, and they warned the state, if you lose affirmative action, if the state of Washington ends it, it's going to have a huge impact on Black businesses. Thank goodness that we have those reports, because some of that was referred to when we were pushing I-1000 to say, we saw it coming and it had that impact. And look at the community now on its back.
Man, that's powerful. Okay, in which case, let's go ahead and get to the next question. It's actually a somewhat of a follow-up question from the last question. So if are Washington State residents that are the Black American descendants of slavery that were affected during that 20-year time period of affirmative action being essentially taken off of the board for them, are they due a specific form of reparations from the Washington State government due to the fact that I-1000 has now reinstated it, and a large amount of the sentiment is I'm sorry? There's an omission of guilt there, that now that we have actual data and reports showing just how much the communities was affected by the damage that occurred from this, this anti-affirmative action bill for certain groups of people. You know what I'm saying? Do you think that Washington state government or they owe reparations to those people who were affected? And full disclosure, I wasn't here at the time, so I ain't getting none. But hey, I'm for it. Go ahead.
Okay, so not African Americans who are the descendants of slavery, because it ended in 1865, and I think Washington state didn't become a state till around like a little bit after that time. But we have a major case that can be made because many of us are the descendants of segregation. Segregation was like slavery with no chains. Some people say segregation was worse because segregation didn't take care of the children. The master didn't have to take care of the children, they have to take care of the elderly. They set the system up. It's a little bit more tricky. And basically, African Americans were sharecroppers. Now, this may sound strange to say, but when I was a kid, I also worked in the bean fields and in the berry fields out in Puyallup for a little while. So what am I trying to say? They had similar sharecropping like work up in the state of Washington. The work that many of the Mexican Americans do now, African Americans used to do that work. The work of cleaning the homes, like so many Latinas do now, African Americans used to do that work on both sides of my family. My grandmothers cleaned homes for whites in the state of Washington. And this is part of segregation. We need to tell the story of segregation. We need to let people know it went from 1877 to about 1970, almost 100 years of slavery-like conditions. If we base things on slavery, we weaken our argument and set ourselves up for people to go, why should I have to pay when we weren't even a state back then? We can tell them, listen, maybe segregation was worse because the way you treated us was like throwaways, and you still didn't pay us for our labor. You still worked us like a dog. And so it's for segregation. But the Supreme Court won't allow us to make a case for segregation. Now, we should make it anyway, because our rights don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God. They come from a sense of truth and right. But I just want you to know. So that's why I'm writing this article on the Southern strategy, what has happened the last 50 years. The Supreme Court said, unless you prove current discrimination and you specify it to every group that suffered and how, and then you go and tailor a program in that area for that group, we ain't giving it to you. That was just the Supreme Court doing their white male thing, doing their white privilege thing. It was right to pay and to put people in position of where they would have been had they not given us almost 190 years of segregation. It was right to give us a remedy for the years of slavery, but the Supreme Court has come in and said, nah, we ain't giving it to you for old systems like that. So we have to prove what's going on now. And that's why I'm working on the work. What has happened in the last 50 years? It has a name. It's called the Southern strategy. And I'm explaining how the Southern strategy and the suburban strategy that went with it has been used to take away the gains of civil rights gains from 1950s to the 1970s, including ending affirmative action. When the state of Washington went after I-200, it was just doing the Southern strategy in another form under a different part of the same umbrella. And it's tricky, it's sneaky, but we got them. And as my dad used to say when he was making gumbos and oxtail stews, if we woke up early in the morning and got around that pot, he was talking to us going, don't let them put you in the trick bag. And he was trying to make a point. The trick bag is when you give them a full amount of something and they give you half a bag and put dirt or rocks at the bottom or have some fake bottom in it. And he was trying to make the point, fool you once, shame on them. Fool you twice, shame on you. He was saying, don't let them trick you. It is our job to explain what they're doing to us and to let us keep not let them keep tricking us. So that's why I'm writing this work. So we are owed something like reparations because of slavery, but they won't give it to us for that. Because of segregation, but they won't give it to us for that. And now there are new S's, the Southern strategy. And that's going on now. We got them. And we ought to be able to get it for that.
Okay, well, I got to give you some pushback on that because that's where the discrepancy lies. You feel me? So, look, slavery is known in America as the original sin. It is known in America the starting point of which all of the dysfunction and disproportionate overrepresentation of African American or Black descendants of American slavery. This is the starting point in which a large majority of our community is overrepresented in places that are largely held the failure in America. We, for all intents and purposes, America is putting its failure into our group based upon the sheer amount of disadvantage we have in every area of life. Not too long ago, the Federal Reserve actually released their wealth data that suggests that over 90% of the wealth of this country is actually in the hands of predominantly white people. And you have over 100 million white homes that's worth over $1 million or more, where in comparison, you have, Black people only worth less than 3% of the wealth in this country, yet we are about 12-13% of the population. And that's just the wealth data. That is the illustration of the racial wealth gap here in this country. Now, with that being said, there is also, I don't know if you know about this, there's the color of wealth study that's going around right now, where they've already went to certain cities in order to see just the wealth schism between certain groups. They went to Los Angeles and they found out that the average Black family that is native to America, a Black American descendant of slave family, they are worth $200. Yet in contrast, you have even Black immigrants who are worth about $100,000 as compared to their native counterparts. And you do other groups like white, you don't even get me started on a white number in Los Angeles. They did the same thing in Miami. In Miami, a black family that are the descendants of slaves are worth less than $2, less than $2, as compared to all the other people in the area. So what I'm trying to say is the effects of what happened in the past informs our present. Now, we can definitely have a discussion about, whether or not what is happening right now is very prevalent. But what I'm trying to say is what's happening now stems from what happened in the past. And there is a clear line of succession of well-documented events that occurred in the past that whittled away our wealth numbers and took away our rights, put us in a position to where we are an exploited class as compared to ownership class that should have received reparations at the time of George Washington, who promised 40 acres and a mule. Instead, we was given a Freeman's Bank, that was unfortunately robbed by the same white people who was supposed to chair the bank. If I'm not mistaken, Frederick Douglass was the one who was ordered to come in order to help help revitalize the bank. However, he couldn't save it. It was too far underwater.
Right.
There was nobody that went to prison. No one went to prison, and there was no restitution for any of the monies lost.
Correct.
All of that progress gone. And you can go to other places, like, for example, the race riots in 1919. All of those towns that we call Black Wall Street, all over the United States, every last one of them was systematically attacked and burned down. And a lot of the large migration that happened from the South to the North was Black families running in fear of their lives from white mobs who was hanging people, lynching them. You see what I'm saying? So, and with that being said, if this is not evidence of what's occurring in a line of secession that leads to this day, then in which case, what makes you think the Supreme Court will, if they're not going to, address that, what makes you think they're going to address a case for the Southern strategy being enacted to this day?
All right. Well, first of all, I'm really glad that you mentioned the those riots and the burning out of our community, burning us out of our communities in 1919, 1920, 1921. I think the Tulsa riot was 1921, and around that time, because that happened during segregation. And the point that I'm making is, yes, you are right that slavery is the original sin. And you are also right that slavery was a tremendous transfer of, it was a significant transfer of resources from our labor that they took from us.
Yeah, definitely.
It brought us wealth from our labor, just like their labor brought them wealth. And they disconnected us from the wealth of our labor, and they made us work for free. And they got rich off of us. And even the ones that didn't have slaves benefited from that, because the slave culture drove the money that helped them get jobs in other areas and all of that. It made them wealthy. It made them
not to mention the intergenerational wealth transfers. You have to also understand that the average slave during that time period was worth more than a house. Right. So when the wealth was generated from our labor and put into the hands of slave owners at the time, these monies was never seized by the government and given back to the the slaves. Instead, they were inherited intergenerationally. But keep going.
But I want to interrupt you, because I want to finish this thought to help you see what I'm trying to say about being the most effective. Like when you're trying to build a people, when you're trying to bring a renaissance, when you know we can do it because we built the pyramids and the great civilizations from East Africa to Central South Africa to West Africa. We have built things like Boley, Oklahoma, Quandar, Kansas, the Black Wall Street. We did what we did in Harlem. We did what we did in the Marcus Garden. We can build. When you're trying to build a people, then you try to figure out what is the most effective message to build a people. So there's certain things we got to say to ourselves, which is that history that we have built before, and here's how we can build again. But there are other things that we got to say to the larger society. And what I'm saying to you is we got a major case that can be made concerning what happened during segregation. And I believe concerning what's happened under the Southern strategy. And I'm just trying to make the point, when you go back 150 years, and then earlier than that, all the way to 350, basically 350 years ago, when you're going all the way back to the Mayflower. And earlier than that, if you're going all the way back to Cortez, and earlier than that, when the first people came over here from Europe, when you're making a slavery argument, you're making a weaker argument to whites that are wondering, why should I be paying you? And so all I'm trying to tell you is, like, when you're boxing, your favorite punch might be that left hook. And slavery might be like that left hook argument, because we know how to make that case. We know that story, and we know it's real. It's like slavery's cut and dry. It's that left hook. But when you see that the opening is a straight right hand, and what you're trying to do is win the fight, then you got to hit them with the straight right hand. And what I'm saying to you is that's the story, that's the argument that we can make about segregation. So I was glad, and the Southern strategy, I'm glad when you talked about them burning us out of Tulsa in 1921, or really you mentioned 1919, and there were other things. And I think Rosewood was close to 1919. Yeah, and definitely. When if you just tell that story, even during during the segregation period, a tremendous amount of wealth was made in the country. Remember, segregation begins in 1877, and segregation ends in 1970. 1970. Probably most of America's wealth was created during that period, from 1877 to 1970. And so if we make a case as to what they did to us, we take away some of their counter arguments. Oh, it's too old, it's too old. And we got a major case that can be made about what they did. And then when we make the case from the Southern strategy, which is harder to make, we don't want to make it if we don't have to, but sometimes, I mean, they're not giving us a choice. I told you what the Supreme Court's saying. You got to prove current discrimination in specific areas to specific groups, and you got to tailor the plan to those groups in those areas. Okay, so they're making us argue, they're making us make that case. We can even make that. And when we get done making it, yes, they owe us if they're trying to do right. They owe us if they really believe that you owe a remedy if you have injured somebody, which they say they do downtown every single day. They really do owe us, but that case we have to make. And so, yeah, it would be easier making a slavery argument because then you don't have to work that hard making the case, but they don't make it easy because they ain't trying to pay us. And so I'm saying, I'm not going to get locked on only making a slavery or mainly making a slavery argument when they have already told me they don't want to pay for that. So I'm like, well, what will you pay for? They're like a current argument. Then I go back and do my homework and I'm going to get them on that one. And when I get them on that one, I'm still going to say, yeah, now you didn't want to hear it, but we're still going to make an argument from slavery because we're going to do that for our children. And we're going to do that for right. Like they say, the arc of justice is the arc of actually I forget, something like the arc of truth is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's a just thing to even argue about slavery because we can't give up on what they never paid us for. But on the other hand, we're not going to be locked on making an argument that they won't listen to because we're trying to get something done. We're trying to build a community.
Well, all right, Professor Livingston, this has been an amazing time sitting with you, hearing your thought-provoking responses, and, you know, just having the opportunity to chop it up with you again after all this time. Thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, my last thought is I'm just so proud to be interviewed by a young griot, a thinker, a warrior that's going to help take us from where we are to where we need to go. It's people like me that might have one or two ideas, and there's people like you that can take those ideas to the people. I can't reach them like you can. And to see you in your setting, to catch up with and learn more about Minutes Till Dawn, I'm proud to be here in this moment. I just want to tell you, thank you, young griot, and keep going because just as Dr. Leonard Jeffries said, we're on a victorious path, and you're going to help take us there.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything you've been doing throughout the years. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right. And we're signing out. Everybody, y'all be cool. Much love to y'all. Everlast.